Hello, Brubs. We're back with The Devil and the Jews. The medieval conception of the Jew and its relation to modern anti Semitism by Joshua Trachtenberg. I did have Adultery for Adults, Unfinished Funeral by, I can't remember the author, and a book on Mary Todd Lincoln's Madness, but I chose this book instead because of copyright concerns. And Trachtenberg is long dead, so he can't really complain. Plus, there is the ever present, omnipotent, I guess it's not omnipotent, but ever present, omnipresent subject of Jewish and Israel in particular going on at the time. The Juden Sau, an early 17th century version of a design engraved at the entrance to a bridge at Frankfurt in the 15th century, which was in turn derived from an older and very popular medieval theme. And this is a Anti-Defamation League. I did not know this was a ADL book, but there it is. Foreword by Mark Saperstein. This is a 1943 book, obviously published later in 1983. And we're going to the foreword by Mark Saperstein. The career of Joshua Trachtenberg reflects a pattern familiar in traditional European Jewish communities, but rather unusual in 20th century America. For almost 30 years, from his ordination at Hebrew Union College to his death at age 55 in 1959, he was a full-time congregational rabbi, first in Easton, Pennsylvania, and then in Teaneck, New Jersey. He was active in Jewish communal affairs as a leader of American labor Zionism and as associate editor of the Reconstructionist magazine. Yet, despite a visual impairment that made sustained research difficult, he produced two major scholarly works, the importance and value of which have not diminished despite the passage of more than 40 years since their first appearance. These two books, Jewish Magic and Superstition, which I've read a chapter or two of, 1939, and The Devil and the Jews, 1943, share several common features. Both focus on the period from the 11th through the 16th centuries. Both are concerned with popular religion, concentrating less on official proclamations and authoritative writings of the religious establishment than on sources that illumine the beliefs, attitudes, and assumptions of the masses. Both books achieve an unusual balance of thoroughness and intelligibility, scholarly precision, and felicitous expression. Substantively, also, the point of contact is clear. Trachtenberg's thesis is articulated in the brief opening chapter of Jewish Magic and Superstition, which appears in retrospect as a concise adumbration of the devil and the Jews. Is adumbration a shortened version? I'm not sure. One of the most powerful motifs in the popular conception of the Jew throughout the Middle Ages and into early modern times was the image of the Jew as sorcerer and magician. And I believe in Trachtenberg's Jewish Magic and Superstition, a lot of that was related to the fact that many Jews were doctors or physicians at the time. Obviously, in the Middle Ages, they were more like witch doctors, but when a Jewish doctor would cure a patient, it was thought of as witchcraft, and when he didn't cure the patient, it was also thought of witchcraft against the patient. So it was kind of a no-win situation, and I believe a lot of the early physicians, so to speak, whatever you would call that, in the Middle Ages, were were Jewish. This conception, undergirding the accusations that Jews were well poisoners and spreaders of disease, desecrators of the host, and murderers of Christian children, created the aura of fascination and dread with which the Jew was regarded by so many medieval Christians. Jewish magic and superstition is a study of the truth behind the legend. I'm Jewish? No, I'm not Jewish. I'm not a Zionist. I'm a semi-literate Polak. Jewish magic and superstition is a study of the truth behind the legend, investigating the magical practices and superstitious beliefs attested in Jewish sources. I should say half Polish. The Devil and the Jews probes further into the legend itself, concluding that the magic which Christendom laid at the door of the Jew had very little relation to the magic current in Jewish circles. It was a reflection of beliefs and practices current among Christians, page 59. The two books can therefore be viewed as complementing each other, one based entirely on Jewish texts, the other completely on Christian material. There is a significant difference in tone, however, that derives not only from the subject matter, but from the change in the world situation between 1939 and 1943. If Jewish magic and superstition begins with a passing reference to the anomalous position of the Jew in the modern world, The Devil and the Jews begins with a cry de coeur. I'm not sure if I pronounced that correctly. Why are Jews so cordially hated and feared? As the author's preface makes clear, this is not scholarship isolated from the vital issues of the contemporary world, nor, what is often worse, is it scholarship harnessed to prior ideological commitment, sifting through ancient texts for evidences that will buttress conclusions drawn before the research began. It is a scholarship both responsible and engaged, analyzing historical material in its own context, but not permitting the facade of academic objectivity to preclude a suggestion of contemporary implications. The range of historical sources used is impressive. There are, of course, the official statements, papal encyclicals and bulls, legal codes, celebrated chroniclers, but the heart of the book is in the sources that have been less frequently discussed despite their critical importance as windows to the popular mind in an age when literacy was rare. The Miracle Mystery, Passion and Antichrist plays, the folk and nursery tales, the popular sermons, the legend cycles, and beginning with the 16th century, the polemical pamphlets. These written texts are supplemented with material from the graphic arts, particularly engravings and prints from popular books, amply and vividly reproduced. There is the Judensau suckling a Jewish boy in the presence of the devil frontispiece, a Jew rendering homage to Satan, page 30, a Jewish woman who has just given birth to two pigs, page 53, a group of Jewish men piercing the host with knives, page 112, a Jew conjuring the devil with blood, secured through a ritual murder, page 136, and Satan, wearing a Jewish badge, huckstering with Jews in their financial transactions, page 195. These pictures retain their power to shock even after the Nazi era. One can only surmise the impact they must have had on a population often more responsive to the pictorial image than to the written word. Yet, reading The Devil and the Jews, a generation after the Holocaust, one is struck by an apparent paradox. If it is true, as Trachtenberg wrote, that the most vivid impression to be gained from a reading of medieval allusions to the Jew is of a hatred so vast and abysmal, so intense that it leaves one gasping for comprehension, page 12, and that the demonic conception of the Jew permeated every layer of Christian society, page 217. How was it that the Jews were tolerated at all in Christian countries through the Middle Ages, expelled from one land or another, to be sure, but never driven out of Christendom as a whole, never made the object of a holy war or extermination as was directed against Christian heretics? For more than a generation, Sallow W. Barron has demonstrated the inadequacy of the lachrymose conception of Jewish history. This is the view, based largely on medieval and 16th century Jewish chronicles, that the experience of the Jewish people in their dispersion was essentially an unending series of massacres and pogroms. It may similarly be noted that the demonic conception so richly documented here is only one aspect of the medieval conception of the Jew. It's the devil and the Jews. It's a medieval conception of Jewish. The medieval conception of the Jew and its relation to modern anti-Semitism. It may similarly be noted that the demonic conception, so richly documented here, is only one aspect of the medieval conception of the Jew. It is not that the material Trachtenberg has marshaled has been distorted. Rather, the selection of evidence to illustrate the link between the devil and the Jew in the popular Christian mind necessarily overlooks other data in which this conjunction does not appear. Right. Trachtenberg's work, and my interest in Trachtenberg started with another book of his, Jewish Mysticism, which I found. Most books I don't look for, I just find them randomly, and this one's really interesting. Trachtenberg's work therefore prompts the historians to further investigation, to want to know more about day-to-day contacts between ordinary Christians and ordinary Jews in various countries at different times, and whether such contacts generally reflect the vast and abysmal hatred that Trachtenberg found in his sources. What conception of Jews was held by kings and nobles, by merchants and intellectuals? What are we to make of texts in which Jews are portrayed in neutral or even positive terms? By what criteria can we differentiate between those sources in which anti-Jewish slurs reflect actual social tension and those in which they are frozen, conventional stereotypes largely unrelated to the contemporary reality? I don't know. I'm just reading the book, dude. I have no clue. I have no interest in either side, so I'm just reading the book for what the book is. Just like adultery for adults. I'm against adultery in itself, but I will read this book when I'm done with this book, and I will have whatever opinion I have. And in order to evaluate this material properly, I mean, this book is by the ADL, so you would think it is promoting Judaism, but I have no clue. And like I said, I don't really care what side it's for. I'm reading it for the fact of the book. And in order to evaluate this material properly, it would be important to know more about the medieval Jewish conception of the Christian. A few pious platitudes, such as the righteous of all nations have a share in the world to come, will not suffice, nor should all expressions of hostility be dismissed as an understandable reaction to persecution. Kabbalah, for instance, developed a demonic conception of the Gentile, including Christians, and this too needs to be studied and assessed in a context free from apologetics. Perhaps the most explosive question concerns the responsibility of the Christian church for the attitudes and teachings that the book documents. The anti-Jewish sentiments recorded by Trachtenberg were not simply the work of fanatical eccentrics. Men like Saint Chrysostom, Peter the Venerable, and Martin Luther, all prominent disseminators of anti-Jewish libels, were among the giants of Christian spirituality in their time. Yet Trachtenberg properly indicates that there was a gulf between the official policy of the church and the realistic policy of its adherents. Page 176. That the popes consistently and unambiguously repudiated the ritual murder charge, page 134, that the church officially recognized the right of the Jewish community to persist and maintain its institutions is in the very midst of the Christian society, page 176. That according to church doctrine, the Jews were to be tolerated on humanitarian grounds and indeed preserved on theological grounds, page 164. Trachtenberg drew two apparently conflicting conclusions. Where official church policy was favorable to the Jews, it was unimportant. It is of no point that the church did not directly charge the Jew, qua heretic, with such abominable anti-Christian practices. What matters is that the common people and their clerical mentors made the association, page 207. But where the policy was unfavorable to the Jews, it was more important than any of the political, social, and economic transformations of medieval society in the 12th and 13th centuries, for all these operated against the backdrop of church policy, which determined public opinion and therefore juridical and commercial practice as it affected the Jew, and which must, in the end, bear the major responsibility for the transformation of the popular attitude toward the Jew, page 161, where presentations of the past may have significant repercussions for intergroup relations in the present. It is all the more important that positive contributions be credited alongside the painful record of turpitude and failure. If the Jew is today despised and feared and hated, Trachtenberg writes in his preface, it is because we are the heirs of the Middle Ages. If it is possible for demagogues to sow the seeds of disunion and discord, to stir fanatical emotions, and set neighbor against neighbor, it is because the figure of the demonic Jew, less than human indeed, anti-human, the creation of the medieval mind, still dominates the folk imagination. Page XIV. These words, set down in 1943, express a poignant attempt to relate the legacy of the distant past to the bleak reality of the present. In retrospect, they seem inadequate to express the full measure of the horrors that ensued. What Trachtenberg could not have foreseen was that the Nazi goal of total physical extermination for the Jews went substantially beyond anything that the Middle Ages could summon forth. Nor could he have predicted that the most recent virulent expressions of anti-Semitism, which now continue today, even though this was written, 40 years ago, of anti-Semitism in lands and nations not heir to the medieval Christian tradition. Today, the causes of what Maurice Samuel called the Great Hatred seem more complex than previously imagined. But all this is to indicate how Trachtenberg's book continues to stimulate our thinking in our research today. The Devil and the Jews is a valuable treatment of source material that is nowhere else so readily accessible. It remains important as a study of history of popular religious beliefs and of the fateful encounter between two communities of faith. Though disturbing and even painful to read, no one interested in the future of Christian-Jewish relations can afford to remain ignorant of what is contained in this masterful investigation of the past. Cambridge, Massachusetts, June 1983. How long is this preface? 4 or 5 pages. Preface. Not so very long ago, Archibald MacLeish bitterly castigated the irresponsibles who in our time elect the safe seclusion of pure scholarship or art and either disdain or fear to descend into the heart of the conflict. Certainly at a time when the world is tortured with bloodshed and tyranny, when hasn't it been? When our culture and perhaps civilization itself are in jeopardy and men by the millions pit their lives to preserve them, I cannot escape a self-conscious twinge of guilt to be caught rummaging in musty medieval texts. If the pen is a weapon, ought I not be wielding mine, feeble though it be in the thick of the battle? Yet even medieval texts have a pertinency for today, and what has been brought between the covers of this book is not without meaning for our world. There is an abiding value in the discovery and statement of the truth. Surely this is the greatest of all the principles for which we fight. Even a world in turmoil needs the truth, perhaps such a world especially. The problem that is treated here has become one of increasing importance to the peace of the world. To elucidate its background is to render it the better understood, and thus perhaps to move it a step nearer solution. I am under no illusion as to the immediate practical utility of such an investigation, but at least for the record, and for those who cherish truth above fancy, the story is here. I undertook this work with no preconceived notions. Indeed, when I started it, I had no idea it would lead in this direction. This book is an outgrowth of my earlier book, Jewish Magic and Superstition, in particular of its first chapter. It was my aim to examine more thoroughly than I had been able to the accusation of sorcery against the Jew, but before long I realized that the subject had far deeper implications, that it involved, in fact, not alone this one charge, but the entire medieval conception of the Jew, and that this same conception in another vocabulary, don't you dare close, will still prevails through much of the world. If the Jew is today despised and feared and hated, it is because we are the heirs of the Middle Ages. If it is possible for demagogues to sow the seeds of disunion and discord, to stir fanatical emotions and set neighbor against neighbor, it is because the figure of the demonic Jew, less than human, indeed anti-human, the creation of the medieval mind, still dominates the folk imagination. And mind you, this book was written in the 40s. Before World War II and World War II, not World War II. Like I said before, I drank 2 martinis. Espresso martinis, as prescribed by a coworker. So I'm slurring a little bit. Out of the mouths of babes and sucklings we may still learn the unvarnished truth. It came to the father of a friend of mine recently when he parked his car in a small French-Canadian town. 2 youngsters at play in the street ran over and peered curiously at its occupant. C'est un juif, declared the older, and I'm sure I botched that. And wiser, after a moment's consideration, mais non, protested the other in his innocence. Ce n'est pas un juif, c'est un homme. Again, I botched it. When I repeated this to another friend, he told me that he had overheard the same exchange in South Africa. Daar komt een mens, remarked the boy, and his companion corrected him. Der is geen mens, dit is een Jude. Obviously, we must at last recognize the lie is a more potent weapon, skillfully wielded, than the bare and simple truth, as Adolf Hitler once so forcefully declared and has since demonstrated. For the lie can be molded to match the will to believe. The truth is made of less malleable stuff. The exaggerated materialist interpretation of history, no less than the demagogic, has fostered its own willful distortion of truth. That anti Jewish sentiment is the product of social and economic tensions is true, but yet only half the truth. Maurice Samuel, in his remarkably sensitive and astute book, The Great Hatred, has done a superb job of puncturing the exclusively materialistic interpretation of anti Semitism, which is something else again, a psychological cultural phenomenon altogether outside the ken of materialists. The distinction is crucial. I must emphasize, in order to avoid misunderstanding, that this is not a study of anti Jewish prejudice in all its aspects, and that this book does not purport to tell the entire story. My concern here is with that element in the complex of anti Jewish prejudice which renders it different in expression and intensity from other manifestations of racial or minority antipathy, the demonological. Samuel's insistence upon the unique demonological character among group hostilities of anti Semitism, upon its diabolization of the Jew, is startlingly, startlingly startlingly apt and correct and basic. It was from him that I first heard the term demonic Jew, long before I, and perhaps he too, was aware of its literal appropriateness. Without my intending it so, this book has developed into a chapter and verse demonstration of the historic correctness of this thesis. In acknowledging with gratitude the interest and counsel of a number of friends, I must first offer my thanks to the audience, which generously criticized the thesis when it was embodied in a paper presented before the Jewish Academy of Arts and Sciences in New York City in November 1939. One highly respected reverend gentleman unwittingly encouraged me to continue my research with the contention that this is an inopportune time to revive the unpleasant memories stirred up by the subject matter. Why dig up all this muck at a time when anti Semitism has attained such intensity? Just so, could there be a better time? And it was Professor Morris R. Cohen's suggestion that such a study is incomplete without an indication of origins and causes that produce the final section of this book. The first draft was read and criticized by Professor Salo W. Barron of Columbia University and Guido Kish of the German Institute of Religion, and by Dr. Solomon Grazel of Philadelphia, from whose generous advice I profited greatly. Indeed, it was at the instance of Professor Kish that I continued the work, and with his graciously proffered assistance that I revised and expanded it to its present shape and size. I have also benefited from the criticism of Professor Roland H. Bainton of Yale University, who read the manuscript before publication. Responsibility for the contents, of course, remains exclusively mine. I am grateful, too, to the libraries that took the trouble to store up the books without which this work would not have been accomplished. Only one who has hunted in vain through card catalog after catalog for some obscure item can appreciate the sense of personal favor conferred by the holy and personal institution which has foreseen and provided for his need. They are too many to name, but to Miss Mary Fried of the Jewish Theological Seminary Library, I owe special thanks for her kindness in facilitating my use of the institution's rich collection. My wife, as always, was an unremitting stimulus and aid, as only she can be. And to Judith Merriam, too, I am indebted for keeping the peace when my work demanded it. Joshua Trachtenberg, Easton, Pennsylvania. Let's see how long the introduction is. I assume it's not going to be long, but I could be totally wrong. No, it's not too long. It's probably going to take 20 minutes, but here we go. Who wrote the introduction, does it say? No. Let's see if it's Trachtenberg himself. Doesn't say, so I assume it's Trachtenberg, but we don't know. Introduction, Medieval Superstition and Modern Anti-Semitism. And by modern, this is 1939. Why are Jews so cordially hated and feared? By what mysterious legerdemain can a weak, defenseless minority be invested in the public eye with the awesome attributes of omnipotence? How is it that men believe of the Jews what common sense would forbid them to believe of anyone else? These are questions that must bother many people. Yet, for all the vast polemical literature that modern anti-Semitism has produced, they are questions that still await a satisfying reply. Every charge against the Jews, sober or intemperate, has elicited its meticulous and solemn defense. On the basis of cogency of argumentation and sheer weight of statistics, Jew hatred should long since have been exercised, but it flourishes, a menace not alone to the peace of mind and bodily security of the Jewish people, but just as much these days to the inner cohesion and stability of all democratic nations. Jew hatred is hardier than the liberal utopians who place their trust in reason and knowledge imagined. All the statistics and arguments that have been advanced to refute anti-Semitic libels have not succeeded in effectively demolishing a single one of them. They thrive apparently in very despite of the fact that they can be and are so easily exploded. No lie is too petty or too silly or too weak to work its calculated effect. Roosevelt a Jew, the New Deal a Jew deal, Benjamin Franklin the author of a vicious anti-Jewish diatribe, do Jews control commerce and industry or the press or whatever else you please? What about the Aryan race and the pariah non-Aryans? Historians and sociologists and economists, how do you say that? Economists, there you go, dummy, and anthropologists and all the rest, not to mention simple lovers of truth and justice can argue themselves blue in the face. But those who believe these fables go on believing and acting as though they were true. Why in heaven's name is this? There can be but one answer. People believe such things because they want to believe them. They are predisposed to accept any and all accusations, irrespective of objective merit, that fit into their preconceived notion of the Jew. The specific charges are nothing more than rationalizations of an underlying animus. If one is temporarily outmoded, a dozen others spring up in its place, and they need but be superficially plausible to be embraced as gospel truth. Hatred of the Jew is not the result of a rational process. If it were, the absurdity of anti Semitic accusations would stifle it stillborn. A casual examination of the stock and trade of anti Jewish agitation reveals a mixture of contradictory and mutually concealing generalization or canceling generalizations that no man of any degree of intelligence could credit. How can one believe that all Jews are at the same time communists and capitalists in the face of the obvious untenability of all such generalizations, in the face of the well-known lower middle class and proletarian economy and general poverty of the Jewish masses? Right. I burned books before, but I was trying to stay warm. Where was I? And general poverty of the Jewish masses, in the face indeed of the logical contradiction inherent in the dual characterization. The attempt to prove logically and statistically that this is not so can quite apparently make no impression upon minds that are blind ab initio to all too evident truth of the matter. No hatred of the Jew rests upon no rational base. When everything possible has been said about the psychological xenophobia that rejects difference and resents minority cultures, about the economic and social frictions that exacerbate social relations, about the astute and persuasive propaganda techniques of anarchical demagogues, about the need for a scapegoat for release of social tension, about the imperfections of the Jews themselves and their abnormal economic status, and all these are potent, immediate stimuli of active Jew hatred. The ultimate source, buried deep in the mass subconscious, is still untouched. Underneath the present stimuli and contributing to them, their explosive potentiality, lies the powder keg of emotional predisposition of a conception of the Jew which has nothing to do with facts or logic. What is the real meaning of the charges leveled against the Jew, whether as intentional communist or an international, whether as international communist or international capitalist, and all the more as the two in one, he is the archenemy of Western civilization. He is alien not to this or that land, but to all Western society, alien in his habits, his pursuits, his interests. His character is very bland. Wherever he lives, he is a creature apart. He is the arch degenerate of the world, infecting its literature, its art, its music, its politics, and economics, which the subtle poison of his insidious influence, ripping out its moral foundation stone by stone until it will collapse helpless in his hands. This is his final goal: to conquer the world, to refashion it in his own craven image, enslave it to his own alien ends. Anti Semitic propaganda paints a fantastic Jekyll Hyde portrait of the international Jew, ostensibly meek and powerless, impoverished and oppressed, few in number and pitifully disunited, but in reality wielding immense power, dominant everywhere by virtue of his world embracing secret organizations, his iron discipline, his unprincipled methods. Absurd, yet this is the conception that makes it possible. What am I at? Battery was. I think I'm getting rather low. I'm at 15%. Absurd, yet this is the conception that. Oh, wait, where am I at? Absurd, yet this is the conception that makes it possible for a large part of the world to believe that the elders of Zion plot world destruction and conquest while Jews in the hundreds of thousands fall victim to Nazi barbarism. The Jews engineered the Bolshevik Revolution and foisted communism upon an unwilling Russian people. The policy of the Soviet Union has ever since been a Jewish policy, and the Comintern has been manipulated for Jewish ends. Jews stabbed Germany in the back and caused her defeat in 1918. The Jews rule, or rather misrule, every state that has not yet seen the light and blasted their power. Read, the democratic nations, indeed, plutocratic democracy is a sinister Jewish scheme to dominate the earth. Behind the scenes, it was the Jews who made the present war and who successfully conspired to drive America into it. Always the Jews and always engaged in antisocial, destructive enterprise. The basis of the Jewish religion affirms the high priest of modern anti-Semitism, comprises a direct criminal assault on all nations of the earth. Such contentions, it is true, are usually advanced by tyrants and demagogues who cynically clothe the naked absurdity of their case and the naked depravity of their motives in a plausible veil of racial and economic abracadabra. This is scientific anti-Semitism, but anti-Semitism is scientific only for those few who demand an intellectual camouflage to conceal their aims and prejudices. What does all this add up for the people, for the inchoate? I don't know how to say that word. Spellbound mass of men and women free from all taint of philosophy and science, who provide the grist for the anti-Semitic mill. To them, the Jew represents the mysterious, fearsome, evil forces which from time immemorial have menaced the peace and security of mankind. The hypocritical hocus pocus of the professional anti-Semite makes its calculated impression. The simple common man may not comprehend its sound, but he does understand its meaning. This is simply the new way of expressing his inherited dread. The mass mind is eminently retentive. Man, in Nietzsche's definition, is the being with the longest memory, and Jose Ortega I don't know how to say that. Gasset has recently affirmed in his Toward a Philosophy of History the objective existence of the accumulated past as a positive element in creative action. But we cannot neglect the reality of the accumulated past as a negative influence, a pathological barrier to creative action. Man's inability to forget is the obverse of his faculty of memory. We may please to consider ourselves moderns, but under our skeptical rationalism and scientific objectivity, the conceptions of our forefathers are still potent, motivating forces. If we have succeeded in banishing ancient notions from our conscious minds, and it need hardly be pointed out that a vast portion of the Western world has not yet exorcised the spirits and ghosts that preyed upon their ancestors. They have merely receded into the murky depths of the subconscious. Rationalize as it may, the Jew whom the world fears and hates is a heritage from the past and the not so distant past. At that, all our wrestling with the rationalizations is pointless effort until we uncover the hidden emotional roots from which illogic and untruth acquire the color of truth and meaning. It is no sheer accident that Germany has become the motherland of modern anti-Semitism. And like I said, this is from 1939. So the program of National Socialism has simply brought to the surface and intensified the latent hankering of the German people for its romanticized past. Otto D. Taliscus, I don't know how to say it, the distinguished foreign correspondent who has observed Germany at close range throughout its crisis years, offers in his book, They Wanted War, a pat characterization of this spiritual regression. The German people, he remarks, is dominated by Richard Wagner, not the Richard Wagner of the incomparable, though still debated melodies, but the Richard Wagner who brought back to life the dismal, pitiless, and forgotten world of German antiquity, the world of fighting gods and fighting heroes, of dragons and demons, of destiny and pagan epics, which presents itself to other people as mere Wagnerian opera. but which has become subconscious reality to the German masses and has been elevated to the inspirational mythos of the National Socialist movement that rules the Third Reich. We need not quarrel about how far back we must trace Germany's psychic atavism. It is the sober fact that seems unimpeachable. If the Nazi program has sometimes been loosely described as medieval, in the matter of its Jewish policy, it assuredly harks back to the psychology of the Middle Ages. Modern so called scientific anti Semitism is not an invention of Hitler's, but it was born in Germany during the last century, and it has flourished primarily in Central and Eastern Europe, where medieval ideas and conditions have persisted until this day, and where the medieval conception of the Jew, which underlies the prevailing emotional antipathy toward him, was and still is most deeply rooted. Medieval defines not a chronological but a mental epoch. Hitler's contributions stemmed from his intuitive awareness of the elemental universality of this conception. Call it inspiration or shrewdness. He sprayed the world with the anti Semitic virus, knowing that it would everywhere fall upon hospitable ground, breeding the spiritual and social corruption that would open to him the path of conquest. The proficiency of the Jews in magic and their kinship with Satan would reveal, if we had the stomach to pursue the subject, the ultimate spring of medieval Jew hatred. Remarks Marvin Lowenthal in his study of the Jews of Germany. This is the conception based upon the crassest superstition and credulity that has permeated to the lower depths of Western culture, and which we must have the stomach to pursue and expose to the light of day if we are to comprehend the ultimate spring not only of medieval Jew hatred, but of its modern, occasionally more sophisticated version. Here in this region of the mass subconscious, we shall uncover the source of many a weird notion of the horned Jew, of the Jewish thirst for Christian blood, of the Jew who scatters poison and disease broadcast, and of the secret parliament of world Jewry, meeting periodically to scheme and plot of a distinctive Jewish odor, of Jews practicing black magic and blighting their surroundings with the evil eye, advanced by official Nazi publications for all the scientific verbiage of current anti Semitism. But more important, here we shall uncover the spring of the general conviction that prompts Jew hatred, of the Jew as an alien, evil, antisocial, and anti human creature, essentially subhuman indeed, and therefore answerable for the supreme crime of seeking to destroy by every subversive technique the fruits of that Christian civilization which in his heart of hearts he despises and abhors. Anti Jewish prejudice is older and more extensive than Christendom. It would be absurd to attribute its every manifestation to doctrinaire Christian hatred of the Christ killers, but its unique demonological character is of medieval origin, with premonitions in earlier times of the turn it was destined to take. The demonic Jew was born of a combination of cultural and historical factors peculiar to Christian Europe in the later Middle Ages. It should be unnecessary to point out that this study is not polemical in intent. However, since the material assembled here emanates from Christian sources, it becomes necessary to add a word about the position of the church. The facts have been permitted to tell their own story, but it was not easy at times to steer a clear course between the often contradictory positions taken by the church. Actually, there were two churches: the hierarchy, which laid down and defined general principles, and the lesser clergy and the laity, who translated principles into practice. The two were not always in agreement. This is notably true insofar as the Jews were concerned, for the hierarchy was often inclined to be humane and to extend a degree of protection to them, whereas the people, inspired usually by the local clergy, were not equally disposed by a strict interpretation of canon law and ecclesiastical pronouncement to exercise the restraint demanded of them. The result was that practice and principle were often at opposite poles. The people frequently chose to act upon the implication of a policy which officially excoriated the Jews while extending them the promise of protection. But the people were the church just as much as the hierarchy was. Both made the history of Christendom. I have sought, where necessary, to distinguish their attitudes toward the Jew, but it must be said that whether they were in agreement or not, the practical consequences of Christian principle are justly attributable to the church. The medieval conception of the Jew is the subject of this study. We shall have to consider it at some length, for it is so foreign to our modern point of view, to many, no doubt, so incredible, that only extended demonstration can persuade us that it was actually and literally held, and that it must still be reckoned with in our own time. It may bring no comfort to concede this, but the wealth of evidence at our disposal is too overwhelming in its cumulative effect to permit of any other conclusion. And that, I assume, is Trachtenberg's introduction, since he wrote the book and no one else is named. And Trachtenberg, I think, died in the 40s, before World War II. And the book was definitely written in 43. Foreword by Mark Saperstein. This edition published. Oh no, the page is falling out. No. All right, that's all for the introduction, the forewords, and all that blather. How long is this first chapter? Looks pretty damn long. All right, bruvs, that's all for now. 53 minutes of not bad reading, considering I was drinking espresso martinis. It actually kind of gave me clarity. Why do you have a fire lighter? For this candle. Does that answer your question, bruv? I don't know how long ago you asked that question, but that's my answer, to light my candles, which I will blow out and make a dramatic ending. The only truth is Father's words. With Islam isn't any better. Yes, bruv. Yeah. I've been wanting to read this book and Trachtenberg's other books, but as I said, I was going to read a book on Mary Lincoln's madness, but I was worried about copyright. This guy's been dead for like 70 years, so he can't really fight the copyright. And I don't know how long ago these women died, but this book is really interesting sounding. But this one, like I said, was under the Mary Todd Lincoln book, and I'm not inclined to get a strike against me. There's chapter 2. So how long is this first chapter? Page 31. When does it actually start? Does it start on 1? No, it starts on 11. So that's 20 pages. I will get to that next time. What else, bruv? My battery's running low. I don't think I remember the last time my battery was at like 5%, but you have 9% battery left. Turn on battery saver. What'll happen? I don't know if I should push that. I'm going to cancel. Anything else, bruv? Before my camera shuts off. Oh, man. Tabasco and books. I have lit the fire, bruv. This book is going to be added to my list. I keep adding new books to my list because I keep adding books at a rate that is inhuman. I only have 4 minutes till I get to an hour, so maybe I'll just wait. I do want to read this, though. Probably shouldn't put that on there. The phenomenon of anti-Semitism is of long standing and one that unhappily still endures. Its roots are many and complex, one blatant strand of anti-Jewish prejudice. Its unique demonological character can be traced to medieval origins. The demonic Jew was born of a combination of cultural and historical factors peculiar to Christian Europe in the late Middle Ages, yet existing in transmuted form in many epochs and in widely varying milieus. The medieval conception of the Jew as devil, literally and figuratively, is the subject of this classic work, first issued in 1943. The full dimension of the diabolization of the Jew is presented through document analysis and illustration. The Jew as devil and demon, as sorcerer, blasphemer and ritual murderer, as desecrator and heretic, as usurer and infidel. The full panoply of the devil's own is analyzed and shown to be based upon the crassest superstition and credulity that has permeated to the lower depths of Western culture. It is a chilling study, but an exceedingly important one, which, as the author observes, we must have the stomach to pursue and expose to the light of day if we are to comprehend the ultimate spring, not only of medieval hatred, but of its modern, occasionally more sophisticated version. In the words of A.L. Sacker, reviewing the book for the New York Herald Tribune, one wishes that Dr. Trachtenberg's volume could be placed in the hands of every minister, every teacher, every educator, indeed all who mold public opinion. Unfortunately, it ended up in my hands. Joshua Trachtenberg was born in London in 1904 and died in 1959, so I guess he did live through World War II. And I don't know what he thought. I guess he didn't write after 44, so all of his books were written not before World War II, but before, I guess, the final outcome of Hitler's quest, or his actions were born fruit. Joshua Trachtenberg was born in London in 1904 and died in 1959. He served in the American rabbinate for nearly 3 decades and was the author of 3 books. Jewish Magic and Superstition, 1939, considered the years 1944 and the Devil and the Jews, which was first published in 1943. Mark Saperstein, who contributes a foreword to this new edition, is Associate Professor of Jewish Studies, Harvard Divinity School. And this is the Jewish Publication Society of America. Get off my book. All right, Bobs, I gotta go. My camera's gonna die at any minute.